June 1839. Chinese Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu stood on the shores of Humen, outside Canton, watching as workers dumped 20,000 chests of opium, approximately 1.4 million kilograms, into specially constructed trenches where it would be mixed with lime and salt water, then flushed into the ocean. The opium belonged to British merchants, confiscated after Lin's ultimatum demanding they surrender all narcotics in their possession and sign bonds promising never to traffic the drug again. The destruction took 23 days. Its value exceeded 2 million British pounds, roughly $300 million in today's currency. The British East India Company, the world's most powerful corporation, had just watched its most profitable commodity literally dissolve into the sea. Within months, the British government would dispatch a military expedition to punish China for destroying British property. The property was poison that had addicted an estimated 12 million Chinese people. The punishment would be a war that forced China to accept continued drug imports, pay massive indemnities, and cede Hong Kong to British control for the next 158 years. This wasn't a conflict between nations over territory or ideology. This was a drug cartel with a navy forcing a customer nation to accept their product. Commercial desperation. The British commercial relationship with China in the 18th century was defined by structural imbalance and cultural friction that created desperate incentive to find product Chinese consumers would purchase. This desperation ultimately led British merchants to embrace opium trafficking as a solution to problems they couldn't solve through legitimate trade. The fundamental issue was that China produced goods Europeans wanted: tea, silk, porcelain, while Europe produced little that Chinese consumers desired. This wasn't due to lack of British manufacturing capability. Britain was entering the Industrial Revolution and producing textiles, metalware, and other manufactured goods at increasing scale and declining cost. But Chinese consumers weren't interested in these products, either because Chinese domestic production was adequate or because the goods didn't suit Chinese tastes. Tea was the critical commodity. British tea consumption had exploded during the 18th century, from elite luxury to mass-market staple. By 1800, Britain was importing approximately 23 million pounds of tea annually, and consumption continued growing. Tea had become embedded in British culture across all social classes. Labourers, merchants, and aristocrats all consumed tea daily. The government derived substantial revenue from tea taxes. Any disruption to tea supplies would create economic and social crisis. China held monopoly control over tea production. The processing techniques required to transform raw tea leaves into the black teas British consumers preferred were closely guarded secrets. Attempts to establish tea cultivation in India or other British colonies had failed. If Britain wanted tea, it had to purchase from China, and China demanded payment in silver. The silver drain was economically and politically problematic. Britain operated under gold standard domestically, but needed silver for Asian trade. Exporting millions of pounds worth of silver annually to pay for tea created monetary pressure that concerned British economic authorities. The silver had to be obtained from Spanish colonies in the Americas or from British mining operations, and its export to China represented wealth, leaving the British economic system with no return except consumption goods. British merchants tried various approaches to balance the trade. They attempted to sell British woolens in China, but Chinese consumers showed limited interest. They tried selling British manufactured goods, but again found inadequate demand. They explored selling products from other parts of Asia or Europe, but nothing generated sales volumes sufficient to offset tea purchases. The East India Company's monopoly on British trade with China gave them both control and responsibility for solving this problem. The company operated under charter from the British Crown that granted them exclusive rights to British trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. This monopoly meant that all British trade with China flowed through company channels. The company collected fees on this trade and managed the commercial relationship with Chinese authorities. But the monopoly also meant the company bore direct responsibility for the persistent trade deficit. British merchants who weren't part of the company complained that better management could balance the trade. Free trade advocates argued that eliminating the monopoly would allow competitive market forces to find solutions. Political pressure mounted on the company to either solve the deficit problem or lose their monopoly. The company's position in India provided one potential solution. By the late 1700s, the company had evolved from purely commercial enterprise into ruling power across large portions of India. Through military conquest, strategic alliances, and political manipulation, the company had become the de facto government in Bengal and other regions. This political control gave them authority to reorganize agricultural production to serve commercial interests. Opium cultivation in India had existed for centuries, primarily for domestic consumption and limited export to Southeast Asia. The Portuguese had introduced tobacco to India and developed techniques for mixing it with opium for smoking. Indian farmers grew opium poppies in certain regions, processing the raw opium into various forms for different markets. The trade was unorganized and relatively small scale. The East India Company recognized that opium offered several commercial advantages. First, it was valuable relative to its weight, making it economical to transport long distances. Second, it was addictive, creating reliable repeat demand unlike most commercial products. Third, it commanded high prices in markets where it was available. Fourth, the company could control supply through their political authority in India. Beginning in the 1770s, the company began systematically organizing opium production in Bengal. They established a monopoly, declaring that all opium grown in districts under their control must be sold to company agents at fixed prices. Farmers in these districts were often required to cultivate opium poppies rather than food crops, creating forced agricultural reorganization that served company commercial interests rather than Indian food security. The cultivation process required significant labor and expertise. Opium poppies must be planted in winter, cultivated through spring, and harvested in early summer. The harvesting is labor-intensive, requiring workers to make careful incisions in the poppy pods, so sap oozes out overnight. The sap is collected the next morning before it dries or is contaminated. Multiple harvests occur as different pods mature. The raw opium sap must then be processed, refined, and packaged for transport. The company established factories where raw opium was processed into standardized cakes, wrapped in poppy petals, and packed into chests. Each chest contained approximately 140 pounds of opium. Quality control was rigorous because the company's reputation depended on consistent product. Different grades were produced for different markets, with the highest quality opium reserved for the China trade where prices were highest. The company auctioned these opium chests at Calcutta to private merchants who transported them to China. This auction system provided the company with legal deniability. They claimed they weren't directly involved in the China opium trade because they sold the opium in India, and what private merchants did with it afterward wasn't the company's responsibility. This was transparent fiction that fooled nobody, but it provided bureaucratic cover for company officials who might otherwise be accountable for drug trafficking. The private merchants who purchased opium at Calcutta were often British agency houses based in India and China. These firms had the capital to purchase large quantities of opium, the ships to transport it, and the connections in China to distribute it. They operated in legal grey areas, avoiding official channels while relying on British military and diplomatic protection when needed. The transportation was itself a sophisticated operation. Fast clipper ships were designed specifically for the opium trade, built for speed to maximize the number of round trips they could make annually between India and China. These ships could sail from Calcutta to the Pearl River Delta in 6 to 8 weeks under favorable conditions. The voyage was dangerous. Storms, pirates, and disease threatened ships and crews, but the profit margins were so high that merchants could afford losses and still profit enormously. Upon reaching Chinese waters, the opium ships didn't enter Canton's legal port. Instead, they anchored at Linton Island or other locations outside the formal trading system. Chinese smuggling boats called fast crabs and scrambling dragons came out to the opium ships, purchased chests, and transported them inland through networks of distributors that reached cities and towns throughout coastal China and eventually into the interior. This system allowed British merchants to claim they weren't violating Chinese law because they never entered Chinese legal jurisdiction with opium. They remained in international waters or uncontrolled anchorages. The actual smuggling was conducted by Chinese criminals who bore the legal risk. If Chinese authorities arrested smugglers or seized opium, that was a Chinese domestic law enforcement matter that didn't involve British merchants. The profits from this trade were extraordinary. Opium purchased at Calcutta auction for perhaps 1,000 rupees per chest could be sold in China for 2,000 to 3,000 rupees depending on market conditions. A merchant ship carrying 1,000 chests could generate profits of 1 to 2 million rupees on a single voyage. Even accounting for ship costs, crew wages, insurance and losses to seizure or storms, the trade was enormously lucrative. These profits began reversing the silver flows that had characterized British-Chinese trade. Instead of silver flowing from Britain to China to pay for tea, silver began flowing from China to Britain as payment for opium. The East India Company could use opium profits to purchase tea, eliminating the need to export silver from Britain. The trade deficit transformed into a profitable exchange where British-controlled opium from India was exchanged for Chinese tea, with silver flowing to Britain as the balancing payment. British merchants and officials rationalized this trade through several arguments. First, they claimed they were simply meeting existing Chinese demand for opium. If they didn't supply it, someone else would. Portuguese, Americans or others. Second, they argued that Chinese prohibition of opium was hypocritical because opium cultivation existed within China itself. Third, they framed the issue as one of free trade. The right of merchants to sell products to willing buyers shouldn't be constrained by governments. Fourth, they noted that many Chinese officials were themselves corrupt participants in the opium trade, accepting bribes to allow smuggling. These rationalizations ignored several fundamental facts. The scale of British imports was creating addiction that vastly exceeded anything that would have occurred from Chinese domestic production or other foreign sources. Chinese prohibition, however imperfectly enforced, represented legitimate governmental authority over internal commerce. Free trade arguments didn't justify trafficking in dangerous narcotics that created dependency rather than voluntary consumption, and Chinese official corruption was partly the result of British merchants deliberately fostering it through bribery. By the 1820s, the opium trade had become central to British commercial interests in Asia. The East India Company derived substantial revenue from opium auctions. British merchants had built fortunes on the trade. British banks financed opium shipments, and the British government collected taxes on Indian opium revenues that helped fund colonial administration. The system had become embedded in British imperial economics in ways that made it difficult to abandon, even if moral or political considerations suggested it should end. Narcotic solution. The transformation of opium from a minor smuggled commodity into the dominant force in British-Chinese trade occurred systematically between 1780 and 1830, driven by deliberate decisions to expand cultivation, improve distribution, and create mass-market addiction. This wasn't passive response to existing demand, but active creation of a narcotics market through sophisticated commercial strategies. The cultivation requirements were specific and demanding. Opium poppies required fertile soil, adequate water, and intensive labor. Planting occurred in November or December, after rice harvests. The poppies grew through winter and spring, requiring weeding, watering, and protection from pests. Flowering occurred in February or March, producing distinctive white or purple blooms. After petals fell, the seed pods were ready for harvesting. The harvesting process required skilled labor. Workers made vertical incisions in the poppy pods using specialized tools, 3 or 4 cuts per pod, carefully angled to allow sap to ooze out without cutting so deep that the pod was damaged. This work occurred in late afternoon, so the sap would flow overnight. The next morning, before sun became too hot, workers collected the coagulated opium sap using small scrapers. A single poppy pod might be harvested multiple times as different parts matured. The raw opium sap was brown, sticky, and bitter tasting. It contained morphine, codeine, and other alkaloids that produced opium's narcotic effects. Processing involved drying, filtering, and shaping into standardized cakes. The company's factories employed thousands of workers performing these tasks. The processed opium was wrapped in poppy petals, packed into chests lined with poppy leaves, and sealed for transport. Quality control was rigorous because the company's commercial reputation depended on consistent product. Opium was tested for morphine content and purity. Inferior product was rejected or downgraded. The result was that Patna and Benares opium, the two main varieties from different regions, became recognized brands in the China market, commanding price premiums based on their reliable quality. The auction system in Calcutta was sophisticated and competitive. The company announced auction dates months in advance, allowing merchants to arrange financing and shipping. The auctions themselves were intense affairs where merchants bid against each other for chests of opium. Prices fluctuated based on market intelligence about Chinese demand, available shipping capacity, and competitive dynamics among merchants. Successful bidders paid the company immediately or through short-term credit arrangements. The company collected the revenue, which flowed into their general accounts and ultimately to the British Treasury as dividends and remittances. The scale of these revenues was substantial. By the 1830s, opium sales generated approximately 1/7 of the East India Company's total Indian revenue. This made the British government financially dependent on drug trafficking in ways that created powerful incentive to protect and expand the trade. The merchants who purchased opium at Calcutta formed a relatively small community of agency houses with the capital and connections to operate in the China trade. Firms like Jardine Matheson, Dent and Company, and others became specialists in the opium business. These firms maintained offices in India and China, owned or chartered ships, employed agents who managed distribution networks, and developed sophisticated understanding of Chinese markets. William Jardine and James Matheson exemplified the opium merchants. Jardine was a Scottish physician who had worked as a ship's surgeon before entering the China trade. Matheson was also Scottish, educated at Edinburgh University. They established their partnership in 1832, building on earlier involvement in the opium business. Their firm became the largest British opium trader, moving thousands of chests annually and developing extensive distribution networks throughout coastal China. These merchants operated with careful attention to risk management and market intelligence. They maintained fast ships that could outrun Chinese patrol boats. They cultivated relationships with Chinese smugglers and distributors who handled inland distribution. They collected information about Chinese enforcement efforts, adjusting their operations to avoid areas where authorities were actively suppressing the trade. And they lobbied British officials to protect their commercial interests through diplomatic pressure or military intervention when necessary. The distribution networks in China were sophisticated and extensive. The opium arriving on British ships at anchorages outside Canton was transferred to Chinese smuggling boats. These boats transported the opium to distribution points along the coast and up rivers. From there, it moved through networks of wholesalers, retailers, and opium den operators who sold directly to consumers. Opium dens became common features in Chinese cities and towns. These establishments provided locations where customers could purchase and smoke opium. The dens ranged from squalid rooms where poor laborers shared pipes to elaborate establishments catering to wealthy merchants and officials. The den operators purchased opium from distributors, prepared it for smoking by further refining and mixing it with other substances, and provided pipes and facilities for consumption. The smoking process involved heating opium over a lamp until it liquefied, loading it into pipe bowls, and inhaling the vapor as it vaporized from the heat. The effects were rapid: relaxation, euphoria, pain relief, and eventual somnolence. Regular users developed tolerance, requiring larger doses to achieve the same effects. Physical dependence developed with regular use, creating withdrawal symptoms if consumption stopped. The progression from occasional recreational use to addiction followed predictable patterns. New users might smoke opium occasionally for pleasure or to relieve stress. Over time, their use became more frequent as tolerance developed, and the temporary escape opium provided became psychologically important. Eventually, many users became physically dependent, experiencing painful withdrawal symptoms, cramping, sweating, anxiety, insomnia, if they couldn't obtain opium. At this stage, users were smoking primarily to avoid withdrawal rather than to achieve euphoria. The social impact of spreading addiction was devastating to Chinese families and communities. Addicted individuals spent increasing portions of their income on opium, leaving insufficient funds for food, housing, or family needs. Their work performance declined as cognitive impairment and physical dependence affected their ability to fulfill responsibilities. Family relationships deteriorated as addiction became the central focus of the user's life. And the financial strain of supporting an addiction often drove families into poverty. Chinese authorities recognized these harms and attempted various enforcement approaches. Some officials tried to suppress opium dens and arrest smugglers. Others attempted to reduce demand by executing convicted opium users, pour encourager les autres. Still others focused on intercepting opium shipments and seizing the drug before it reached distributors. But enforcement faced systematic obstacles. First, corruption was widespread. British merchants deliberately cultivated corrupt relationships with Chinese officials, offering bribes to look the other way. The profits from opium trafficking were so large that smugglers could afford to pay substantial bribes while still profiting enormously. Officials who accepted these bribes became complicit in the trade and resistant to genuine enforcement that would eliminate their illegal income. Second, the enforcement resources available to Chinese authorities were inadequate to the scale of the problem. China's coastline was thousands of miles long with countless anchorages, inlets, and river mouths where opium could be landed. The government didn't maintain a navy capable of patrolling these waters effectively. Customs officials at legal ports could inspect legitimate trade but couldn't control smuggling that deliberately avoided official channels. Third, addiction had spread so widely that eliminating opium would create social crisis. By the 1830s, an estimated 2 million Chinese were addicted. These individuals included government officials, military officers, merchants, scholars, and laborers. Any serious enforcement effort would need to address not just supply, but also the enormous existing demand from addicted population. Attempts to force addicts into withdrawal would create humanitarian crisis and potential social unrest. Fourth, some Chinese merchants and officials had direct financial interests in the opium trade. Chinese smugglers who transported opium inland made substantial profits. Opium den operators built businesses around the trade. Corrupt officials collected bribes. These domestic stakeholders had incentive to resist enforcement and to actively undermine officials who attempted serious suppression. The British merchants exploited these enforcement difficulties. When Chinese authorities cracked down in one area, the merchants shifted operations to other locations. When specific officials proved incorruptible, the merchants worked around them or waited for transfers that would bring more cooperative officials. When enforcement became too aggressive, British merchants complained to British diplomatic officials who would pressure Chinese authorities to ease enforcement. By the 1830s, the opium trade had reached a scale that was transforming Chinese society and economy in fundamental ways. Annual imports had reached approximately 30,000 to 40,000 chests, representing millions of pounds of opium. The number of addicts had grown to somewhere between 2 and 12 million, with estimates varying widely, but all agreeing the problem was enormous. The silver outflow to pay for opium was creating monetary crisis as China's silver supply drained to foreign merchants. The economic consequences were severe. Silver was the basis of Chinese monetary system. Ordinary transactions used copper coins, but taxes were collected in silver and major commercial transactions were conducted in silver. As silver became scarce due to opium imports, its value relative to copper increased. This meant that peasants selling crops for copper coins needed more coins to obtain the silver required to pay taxes denominated in silver. The result was effective tax increase that hit poor farmers particularly hard. The social consequences were equally severe. Opium addiction was destroying families, reducing productivity, and creating a class of people whose lives revolved around obtaining and using the drug. The breakdown of traditional social bonds and moral standards was apparent to Chinese officials and intellectuals who wrote extensively about the opium crisis and its corrosive effects on Chinese society. Yet British commercial interests continued expanding the trade. New merchants entered the business, attracted by the extraordinary profits. The East India Company increased opium cultivation in India to meet growing demand. Ship traffic between India and China intensified, and British diplomatic and military officials made clear they would protect British merchants' commercial interests, even when those interests involved drug trafficking that Chinese authorities opposed. Systematic addiction. The creation of mass opium addiction in China between 1800 and 1840 was not an accidental consequence of legitimate commerce, but rather the predictable and intended result of deliberate commercial strategies. British merchants understood that opium's addictive properties created reliable repeat customers, and they actively worked to expand consumption across Chinese society. British merchants recognized that expanding the market required reducing prices and increasing availability. As opium imports grew, economies of scale and competition among distributors drove prices downward. What had been a luxury affordable only to elites became accessible to middle-class merchants, shop owners, and skilled artisans. The customer base expanded dramatically, as did total consumption. The next phase involved reaching working-class consumers, laborers, soldiers, boatmen, and others who performed physical work. For these consumers, opium offered temporary escape from grueling labor, relief from physical pain, and euphoria that contrasted sharply with their difficult daily lives. The drug's ability to suppress appetite and provide energy before tolerance developed made it initially attractive to workers who needed to perform physically demanding tasks. Distributors actively promoted opium to these working-class markets through various strategies. They offered small quantities at low prices, making initial purchases affordable. They sometimes provided free samples to potential customers to create trial usage. They cultivated relationships with employers, military officers, and others who controlled access to working-class populations, and they worked through networks of retailers who operated in markets, neighborhoods, and villages where working people lived. Women represented another target market. Opium's appetite-suppressant effects and association with refined leisure made it attractive to some wealthy women. The drug's pain-relieving properties offered relief from medical conditions in an era when few effective medications existed. And opium's euphoric effects provided escape from the restricted lives many Chinese women experienced. Merchants promoted opium to women through female retailers, and by emphasizing its supposedly medicinal benefits, the elderly became significant consumers as opium was marketed for pain relief and as a source of comfort in final years of life. The drug's legitimate medical uses for pain management blurred into recreational use as elderly consumers found that opium provided both physical relief and psychological escape. Family members sometimes provided opium to elderly relatives suffering from painful conditions, creating pathways to addiction that seemed humanitarian rather than destructive. Even children weren't exempt from the spreading addiction. Some parents gave opium to infants and young children as a sedative or to treat illness. The practice of using opium to quiet crying children or help them sleep created addiction at very young ages. As these children grew, they were already physiologically dependent on the drug. creating lifelong customers who had never chosen to use opium initially. The mechanisms of addiction were well understood by British merchants, even if the underlying neurobiology wasn't. They knew that regular opium use created tolerance, requiring users to consume increasing quantities to achieve the same effects. They knew that physical dependence developed, making it extremely difficult for users to stop without experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms. And they knew that this dependency created captive customers who would continue purchasing opium regardless of price or social consequences. The distribution networks that supplied this growing addicted population became increasingly sophisticated. The initial reliance on coastal smuggling expanded to include inland distribution reaching cities and towns throughout China. The opium traveled along trade routes that already existed for other goods, moving up rivers and along roads into the Chinese interior. By the 1830s, opium was available in cities hundreds of miles from the coast. Opium dens proliferated as the primary retail distribution points. These establishments ranged enormously in character and clientele. High-end dens catering to wealthy customers provided comfortable furnishings, refined atmospheres, and high-quality opium. Middle-range dens served merchants and skilled workers in more modest but still respectable settings. Low-end dens operated in slums and poor neighborhoods, offering minimal facilities where multiple users shared pipes in cramped, unsanitary conditions. The typical opium den provided the basics necessary for consumption. A lamp provided heat to vaporize the opium. Pipes, usually long bamboo or wooden tubes with ceramic bowls, were provided to customers or brought by regular users who owned their pipes. Furniture ranged from proper beds or couches in upscale dens to simple wooden benches in poor establishments. The den operator prepared opium by heating and refining it further, loaded pipe bowls, and collected payment based on the amount consumed. Regular customers developed relationships with specific dens, returning repeatedly to familiar establishments. The den operators learned their customers' preferences, prepared opium to their specifications, and sometimes extended credit to addicts who lacked immediate funds. This credit further entrapped users, as debt to den operators added to the financial pressure created by addiction itself. The social dynamics within opium dens created environments that normalized and promoted continued use. New users were introduced to the practice by experienced users who taught them proper smoking techniques. The communal nature of opium smoking, with multiple users sharing space and often sharing pipes, created social bonds around the drug. And the temporary escape from social constraints within the dens provided psychological relief that reinforced addiction beyond the drug's direct physiological effects. Chinese authorities attempting to suppress opium dens faced systematic obstacles. The dens were widely distributed across cities, making it impossible to shut them all down simultaneously. They could operate semi-clandestinely in residential buildings, making them difficult to identify. When authorities raided specific dens, they could close that location, but the operators often simply relocated and resumed operations elsewhere. And the corruption that pervaded the opium trade meant that many officials responsible for enforcement were themselves receiving bribes to allow dens to operate. The medical profession became unwittingly complicit in spreading addiction through legitimate use of opium for pain relief and treating various ailments. Traditional Chinese medicine had long used opium in limited quantities for specific conditions. As opium became more widely available through the British trade, physicians prescribed it more frequently. Patients receiving opium for legitimate medical conditions sometimes became addicted, transitioning from medical use to dependency. The armed forces represented a particularly concerning locus of addiction. Soldiers and sailors were introduced to opium through various routes. Some used it to cope with the stress and boredom of military life. Others were introduced by fellow soldiers who were already users. Officers sometimes provided opium to troops, either as rewards or as a way to manage morale. The result was that substantial portions of some military units became addicted, severely compromising their combat effectiveness. This military addiction had strategic implications that Chinese authorities recognized with alarm. An army whose soldiers were opium addicts couldn't effectively defend the country. The physical deterioration caused by prolonged addiction reduced soldiers' endurance and strength. The psychological dependence meant soldiers were more concerned with obtaining opium than with military duties, and the possibility that soldiers might desert or fail to fight if their opium supply was interrupted created fundamental unreliability. Government officials' addiction posed equally serious problems. Officials who were addicted to opium were vulnerable to corruption by merchants who could supply the drug. Their judgment was impaired by opium use. Their attention to duties declined as addiction progressed, and their personal moral authority to enforce prohibition was undermined when they themselves were users. The spread of addiction through the official class thus weakened the Chinese state's capacity to respond to the crisis. The scholarly and literary classes experienced significant addiction as well. The association between opium use and refined artistic sensibility led some intellectuals to view smoking as compatible with scholarly pursuits. The drug's short-term cognitive effects sometimes enhanced creative output before tolerance and dependency set in, and the relief from stress that opium provided was attractive to scholars facing examination pressures or political frustrations. But the long-term effects, cognitive impairment, physical deterioration and dependency, were devastating to individuals and to Chinese intellectual culture more broadly. By the mid-1830s, the social consequences of mass addiction were apparent throughout Chinese society. Families were being destroyed financially and emotionally by addiction. Productivity was declining as addicted workers became less capable. Crime was increasing as desperate addicts stole to support their habits. And the moral fabric of society was fraying as traditional values were undermined by the pursuit of opium-induced escape. Chinese intellectuals and officials wrote extensively about the crisis, producing memorials to the emperor, essays analyzing the causes and consequences, and proposals for how to address the problem. These writings recognized that opium addiction was destroying Chinese society and that foreign merchants were deliberately perpetuating the trade for profit. They called for vigorous enforcement of prohibition, severe punishment for users and traffickers, and diplomatic efforts to stop the trade at its source. But British merchants viewed these concerns as irrelevant to their commercial interests. They argued that demand for opium came from Chinese consumers who chose to use the drug. If Chinese society was experiencing problems from opium, that was the result of Chinese choices and Chinese governmental failures to enforce their own laws. British merchants were simply providing a product that willing customers wanted to purchase. The fact that the product was addictive and that consumption was illegal under Chinese law were treated as unfortunate details that didn't affect the legitimacy of the trade. This attitude reflected a broader British imperial mindset that treated non-European societies as markets to be exploited rather than sovereign nations with legitimate authority over their own territories and populations. The Chinese government's prohibition of opium was dismissed as an obstacle to legitimate commerce rather than respected as the exercise of sovereign authority. Chinese social concerns about addiction were treated as exaggerated or hypocritical, and Chinese moral objections to the trade were ignored as irrelevant to British commercial interests. Imperial resistance. The Chinese imperial government's response to the opium crisis evolved from attempted prohibition through diplomatic protest to military confrontation, driven by recognition that foreign drug trafficking was creating national crisis that threatened social stability, economic vitality, and governmental authority. The Qing dynasty emperors who ruled China during the period of expanding opium trade faced a dilemma. They recognized that opium was destroying Chinese society, but they lacked effective mechanisms to stop the trade. Chinese naval forces were inadequate to patrol thousands of miles of coastline against fast foreign ships. Customs enforcement couldn't prevent smuggling that deliberately avoided official channels, and corruption among officials undermined enforcement efforts as those responsible for suppressing the trade were often the very officials accepting bribes to allow it. The Daoguang Emperor, who ruled from 1820 to 1850, received repeated memorials from officials throughout China describing the devastating effects of opium addiction. These reports detailed the social breakdown, economic drain, and military deterioration caused by the drug. They emphasized that the silver outflow to pay for opium was creating monetary crisis, and they warned that the growing addiction among soldiers and officials was undermining the state's capacity to govern and defend the country. The emperor responded with edicts demanding stricter enforcement of existing prohibitions. These edicts called for harsher punishments for users and traffickers, more vigorous efforts to suppress opium dens and seize smuggled opium, and greater accountability for officials who allowed the trade to continue in their jurisdictions. But the edicts had limited effect because the fundamental problems, inadequate enforcement capacity, widespread corruption, and massive existing addiction, weren't addressed. A debate emerged among Chinese officials about the best approach to the opium problem. Some advocated legalization, arguing that prohibition wasn't working and that legal cultivation of opium within China would at least stop the silver drain to foreign merchants. Under this approach, Chinese farmers would grow opium, Chinese merchants would sell it, and tax revenue would flow to the government rather than profits to foreigners. The addiction problem would continue, but at least the economic and sovereignty issues would be mitigated. Others vehemently opposed legalization, arguing it would represent capitulation to foreign pressure and would implicitly endorse drug use. They pointed out that legalization wouldn't solve the social problems caused by addiction and might actually worsen them by making opium more easily available. They emphasized that the emperor had a moral obligation to protect his subjects from substances that destroyed their health and livelihoods, and they argued that vigorous enforcement of prohibition was possible if the emperor appointed incorruptible officials and gave them adequate resources and authority. The Daoguang emperor ultimately sided with the prohibition advocates, particularly after receiving influential memorials from officials who argued that the opium crisis was threatening the dynasty's survival. The most important was from Lin Zexu, an experienced official who had successfully suppressed opium use in other provinces through strict enforcement, combined with programs to help addicts quit. Lin Zexu's memorial to the emperor in 1838 laid out the case for aggressive action against the opium trade. He described how opium was destroying the army, impoverishing the population, and draining silver from China's economy. He argued that if current trends continued, within a few decades China would have neither silver to conduct commerce nor soldiers capable of defending the country. He proposed a comprehensive program combining harsh punishment for traffickers and users with rehabilitation for addicts who agreed to quit. The emperor was convinced. In December 1838, he appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with extraordinary powers to suppress the opium trade in Canton, the center of foreign trade and the primary entry point for opium. Lin's appointment marked a turning point from symbolic prohibition to serious enforcement that would directly confront foreign merchants and ultimately lead to war. Lin arrived in Canton in March 1839 and immediately began implementing his program. He ordered all foreign merchants to surrender their opium stocks and sign bonds promising never to trade opium again on pain of death. He demanded that the Chinese merchants who comprised the Kohong, the officially licensed intermediaries for foreign trade, guarantee the foreign merchants' compliance. And he deployed military forces around the foreign merchants' compound in Canton, effectively placing them under siege until they complied. The foreign merchants, led by British traders like Lancelot Dent and William Jardine, initially refused. They argued that Lin lacked authority to confiscate their private property. They claimed that opium belonged to individual merchants and couldn't be surrendered without compensation, and they insisted that signing bonds promising never to trade opium on pain of death was unacceptable because it would subject British citizens to Chinese legal jurisdiction, including capital punishment. Lin responded by increasing pressure. He cut off food and water supplies to the foreign compound. He arrested Chinese servants working for foreign merchants. He threatened to execute Chinese merchants who comprised the Kohong if they didn't enforce compliance. And he made clear he was prepared to use military force if necessary to obtain the opium and the bonds. The standoff created a crisis for the British merchants. They possessed approximately 20,000 chests of opium, worth over £2 million sterling. Surrendering this much valuable property without compensation would bankrupt many of the merchant houses. But refusing to surrender it might result in military attack, their detention by Chinese authorities, or Chinese execution of the Kohong merchants who were guarantors. The British government's representative in Canton, Captain Charles Elliot, intervened to break the deadlock. Elliot was Britain's superintendent of trade, responsible for managing British commercial and diplomatic relations with China. He faced a difficult situation. On one hand, he understood that the opium trade was illegal under Chinese law and that British merchants were engaged in smuggling. On the other hand, he was responsible for protecting British commercial interests and British citizens. Elliot's solution was to take governmental responsibility for the opium. He ordered British merchants to surrender their opium stocks to him as representative of the British Crown. He promised that they would receive compensation from the British government for the opium surrendered. And he provided the opium to Lin Zexu, not as private merchant property, but as British governmental property, making the confiscation an act by Chinese government against British government rather than Chinese enforcement against private criminals. This maneuver transformed the situation from a law enforcement matter into a diplomatic incident with potential for military confrontation. Lin received the 20,000 chests of opium and destroyed them in an elaborate public ceremony designed to demonstrate Chinese resolve. But the destruction of property that Elliot had defined as British governmental property created grounds for the British government to demand compensation or satisfaction through other means. Lin believed he had achieved a great victory. He had confiscated and destroyed millions of pounds worth of opium. He had forced foreign merchants to acknowledge Chinese authority, and he had sent a clear message that opium trafficking would no longer be tolerated. He wrote to Queen Victoria explaining that opium was poisonous, that it was prohibited in China, and that Chinese authorities would execute anyone, Chinese or foreign, who continued trafficking in the drug. But Lin misunderstood the British response. He expected that once the opium was destroyed and British merchants understood that China was serious about enforcement, the trade would end. He believed that Queen Victoria, once informed about the harm opium caused, would prohibit British merchants from engaging in the trade, and he assumed that without opium to trade, British merchants would have to accept the existing Canton system and trade only in legal goods. He failed to anticipate that the British government would view the confiscation and destruction of opium as an unacceptable violation of British property rights and commercial interests that justified military retaliation. From the British governmental perspective, whether opium should be legal or illegal in China was China's internal affair, but seizing British property without compensation and threatening British citizens with capital punishment under Chinese law violated British sovereignty and required forceful response. The British merchants who had surrendered opium lobbied intensely for government intervention. They portrayed themselves as victims of Chinese aggression. They emphasized the value of property that had been destroyed. They argued that British prestige and commercial interests in Asia required demonstrating that foreign governments couldn't simply confiscate British property with impunity. And they suggested that military action against China could open additional Chinese ports to British trade and end the restrictive Canton system. These arguments found receptive audience in London. The British government in 1839 was controlled by Whigs, who generally supported free trade and British commercial expansion. They were frustrated by China's restrictive trade policies and believed that forcibly opening China to British commerce would benefit both countries, and they faced domestic political pressure from merchants, manufacturers and financial interests who saw China as an enormous potential market that was being kept closed by outdated Chinese policies. The decision to send a military expedition to China was made in late 1839. The official justification was to obtain compensation for destroyed opium, to secure British citizens' safety from Chinese legal jurisdiction, and to establish diplomatic relations on more equal footing. The actual goals were broader: to forcibly open additional Chinese ports to British trade, to end the Canton system and the Cohong monopoly, and to establish British treaty rights and diplomatic representation in China. The moral contradiction of going to war to force China to accept opium imports was apparent to some British observers even at the time. Members of Parliament opposed to the war pointed out that Britain was essentially acting as a drug cartel, using military force to support trafficking in narcotics that Chinese authorities legitimately prohibited. They questioned whether British commercial interests in selling poison to Chinese consumers justified the cost and casualties of war. The most eloquent parliamentary opposition came from William Gladstone, who would later serve 4 times as Prime Minister. In 1840, Gladstone gave a speech condemning the war as unjust and disgraceful. He argued that Britain had no moral right to force opium on China. He pointed out that opium was recognized as harmful even in Britain, where its sale was regulated. He noted that the Chinese government had every right to prohibit substances that destroyed its people's health, and he warned that the war would permanently stain Britain's reputation. But Gladstone's arguments were unsuccessful. Parliament voted to approve funding for the military expedition by a relatively narrow margin, with commercial interests and supporters of aggressive foreign policy overcoming the moral objections. Britain would go to war with China, and the specific trigger would be Chinese destruction of opium that British merchants had been illegally smuggling. Diplomatic breakdown. The period between the destruction of opium in June 1839 and the outbreak of full-scale war in 1840 was characterized by mutual misunderstanding, failed diplomatic efforts, and escalating confrontations that made armed conflict increasingly inevitable. Both British and Chinese authorities believed they were defending legitimate interests and that the other side would eventually recognize the reasonableness of their position. Lin Zexu's approach after destroying the opium combined continued enforcement with attempts at diplomatic persuasion. He wrote letters to Queen Victoria and to British officials explaining Chinese policy and requesting cooperation in ending the opium trade. These letters appealed to moral principles, arguing that Britain surely wouldn't want to export harmful substances that damaged Chinese health and society. Lin assumed that once the British government understood Chinese concerns, they would support prohibition rather than supporting traffickers. The letters revealed Lin's fundamental misunderstanding of British political economy and imperial strategy. He assumed that the British monarch personally controlled trade policy and could simply order merchants to stop trafficking opium. In reality, the British government's role was more complex. Merchants operated independently, pursuing profit opportunities.
The government's function was to protect British commercial interests and British subjects, not to micromanage what products merchants traded.
Lin also failed to understand that British officials didn't view opium primarily as a moral question, but as a commercial and diplomatic issue. From the British perspective, the question wasn't whether opium was good or bad, but whether the Chinese government had properly exercised its authority and whether British commercial interests had been respected. The destruction of opium without compensation violated British property rights regardless of whether the opium trade was moral or legal. The specific incidents that escalated tensions involved Chinese attempts to enforce the ban on opium, combined with British resistance to Chinese legal jurisdiction. After the opium destruction, Lin required foreign merchants to sign bonds promising never to trade opium and accepting that violation would result in execution under Chinese law. Most British merchants refused, arguing that they couldn't accept Chinese capital jurisdiction over British subjects. Captain Elliot supported the merchants' refusal, insisting that British subjects could only be tried and punished under British law. He removed British merchants from Canton to the Portuguese colony of Macau to escape Chinese jurisdiction. Lin responded by pressuring Portuguese authorities to expel the British from Macau. When this pressure succeeded, Elliot relocated the merchants to Hong Kong Island, which was then sparsely populated Chinese territory with no significant governmental presence. From Hong Kong, British merchants attempted to continue trading legally in non-opium goods while refusing to sign the bonds Lin required. Lin responded by prohibiting all trade with British merchants who wouldn't sign the bonds. This trade stoppage created a stalemate. British merchants couldn't trade legally without signing bonds they considered unacceptable, and Chinese authorities wouldn't allow trade without the bonds. The situation was complicated by an incident in July 1839, when drunken British sailors killed a Chinese villager named Lin Weishi during a riot in Kowloon. Chinese authorities demanded that the sailors responsible be handed over for trial and execution under Chinese law. Elliot refused, arguing that the incident occurred outside Chinese legal jurisdiction and that British subjects could only be tried under British law. Elliot conducted his own investigation, identified the sailors involved, and tried them aboard a British ship under British law. They received relatively light sentences that Chinese authorities viewed as grossly inadequate. The Lin Weishi incident became a point of principle for both sides. For Chinese authorities, it demonstrated British contempt for Chinese law and Chinese lives. Foreign sailors had killed a Chinese subject on Chinese soil, and the foreigners refused to accept Chinese legal jurisdiction.
For British authorities, it demonstrated the unacceptability of subjecting British citizens to Chinese law, which included punishments like execution that Britain considered barbaric.
The standoff intensified in September 1839, when Chinese war junks attempted to prevent a British merchant ship from leaving Chinese waters. British naval vessels escorted the merchant ship, leading to a brief exchange of fire between British and Chinese ships. This first Battle of Chuanpi was a minor skirmish, but it marked the first direct military clash and demonstrated the willingness of both sides to use force. Lin responded by completely cutting off British trade. No Chinese merchants were allowed to sell food or supplies to British ships. The Cohong was dissolved, eliminating the official channel for British trade, and military forces were deployed to prevent British ships from approaching Canton or other Chinese ports. The message was clear: either accept Chinese terms including signing the bonds and submitting to Chinese jurisdiction, or leave Chinese waters entirely. Elliot concluded that negotiation was impossible and that only military force would convince Chinese authorities to accept British demands. He sent dispatches to London requesting naval reinforcement and authorization to use force to resolve the dispute. While waiting for these reinforcements, he attempted to maintain British merchant presence in Hong Kong and to prevent complete breakdown of trade. British merchants, meanwhile, lobbied their government intensely for military intervention. The merchant houses wrote letters, published pamphlets, and sent representatives to London, arguing that British commercial interests in China were being destroyed by Chinese intransigence. They emphasized the enormous potential of the China market if restrictive policies could be eliminated, and they portrayed Chinese actions as unreasonable aggression that required forceful response. The arguments these merchants made combined legitimate commercial grievances with deliberate misrepresentation. They were correct that the Canton system was restrictive, and that opening additional Chinese ports to trade would benefit British commerce. They were correct that being confined to Canton and forced to trade through the Cohong monopoly was commercially inefficient. But they obscured the fact that the specific trigger for the crisis was Chinese enforcement against illegal opium trafficking that the merchants themselves had been conducting. In London, the Palmerston government faced a decision about whether to commit military resources to resolve the China dispute. Foreign Secretary Palmerston was sympathetic to the merchants' arguments and supportive of aggressive policies to expand British trade.
He was frustrated by Chinese restrictions on British commerce and believed that demonstrating British military power would convince Chinese authorities to adopt more accommodating policies.
Palmerston drafted instructions for a military expedition that combined demands for compensation with broader requirements for treaty revisions. Britain would demand payment for the destroyed opium. They would demand that additional Chinese ports be opened to British trade. They would demand abolition of the Cohong monopoly and direct access to Chinese merchants. They would demand that British subjects be exempt from Chinese legal jurisdiction, and they would demand establishment of formal diplomatic relations with official British representatives stationed in China. These demands went far beyond addressing the opium destruction. They represented a comprehensive assault on Chinese sovereignty and trading system. If China accepted all these demands, the Canton system would be dismantled, British merchants would have access to China on British terms, and British military power would have forcibly restructured Sino-British relations. The military forces designated for the expedition reflected British confidence in their technological and organizational superiority. The Royal Navy would provide gunboats and ships of the line that vastly outmatched Chinese naval forces. British infantry armed with modern rifles and artillery would face Chinese forces whose weapons and tactics were decades outdated, and British commanders assumed that a few decisive victories would convince Chinese authorities to accept British terms rather than continue a war they couldn't win. This confidence reflected broader Victorian-era attitudes about European superiority over non-European societies. British officials and military officers assumed that European industrial, military and organizational capabilities were so advanced that resistance from non-European nations was ultimately futile.
They believed that demonstrating this superiority through limited military action would convince non-European rulers to accept European demands and adopt European-style modernization.
These attitudes were partly justified by objective military capabilities. British forces were indeed far superior to Chinese forces in most respects, but they underestimated Chinese resolve, misjudged Chinese political dynamics, and failed to consider the long-term consequences of forcing unequal treaties on China through military coercion. The British assumed that after a brief military demonstration, normal commercial relations would resume on improved terms. They didn't anticipate that the treaties imposed through force would create lasting resentment and contribute to a century of Chinese humiliation and instability. Military conquest. The First Opium War, fought between 1839 and 1842, was a one-sided conflict where British industrial military technology overwhelmed Chinese forces that relied on tactics and weapons unchanged for centuries. The war demonstrated the military implications of the Industrial Revolution and initiated a pattern of European military intervention in China that would continue for decades. The British Expeditionary Force arrived in Chinese waters in June 1840, consisting of 16 warships, 4 armed steamers, 27 transport ships, and approximately 4,000 troops. This represented a fraction of total British military power, forces that could be spared from other commitments to conduct what British planners expected would be a brief punitive expedition. The Chinese forces facing them numbered in the hundreds of thousands, but their numerical superiority was more than offset by technological and organizational disadvantages. The most significant British advantage was naval power. British warships were built of strong timber, armed with numerous cannon that could fire accurately at long range, and crewed by professional sailors trained in coordinated naval tactics. Some British ships were steam-powered, allowing them to maneuver independent of wind and current. These vessels could approach Chinese coastal fortifications, bombard them from positions the defenders couldn't reach, and withdraw before Chinese forces could respond effectively. Chinese war junks were constructed differently, built more for cargo capacity and coastal patrol than for fighting modern warships. They carried fewer guns, and those guns were often antiquated models with shorter range and lower accuracy. Chinese naval tactics relied on boarding and hand-to-hand combat, which required getting close to enemy vessels. But British ships could destroy Chinese junks with cannon fire from distances that prevented boarding attempts from succeeding. The British strategy was to blockade major Chinese ports, seize strategic points along the coast and major rivers, and threaten China's crucial internal trade routes until Chinese authorities agreed to negotiate. The campaign began with a naval demonstration off Canton, but when Chinese authorities there proved resistant to negotiation, British forces moved north to the Yangtze River Delta and threatened Nanjing, China's second capital and a critical commercial center. The military engagements followed predictable patterns. British forces would approach a Chinese defensive position, typically a coastal fort or a position along a river. British ships would bombard the position from long range while Chinese defenders attempted unsuccessfully to return fire with their shorter range guns. British troops would land and attack the position from land while British ships provided supporting fire. Chinese defenders, often brave but poorly equipped and inadequately trained for modern warfare, would resist briefly before being overwhelmed. The Battle of Canton in May 1841 exemplified these dynamics. British forces approached Canton with approximately 2,400 troops supported by naval gunfire. Chinese forces defending the city numbered around 45,000 troops plus local militia. but the Chinese defenders were positioned in fixed fortifications that British ships could bombard systematically. After reducing the fortifications with naval gunfire, British troops landed and captured the positions with minimal casualties. The Chinese forces suffered thousands of casualties while British casualties numbered fewer than 10. Similar patterns occurred at Amoy, Ningbo, and other coastal cities. Chinese commanders recognized that Chinese forces couldn't defeat British forces in direct confrontation, but political pressure from the emperor and from public opinion demanded resistance. The result was a series of defeats where Chinese forces fought bravely but ineffectively against vastly superior military technology and organization. The disparity in casualties reflected the military mismatch. Across the entire war, British forces suffered approximately 500 military deaths, most from disease rather than combat. Chinese military and civilian casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. The difference wasn't primarily due to British tactical genius or Chinese cowardice. It reflected industrial-era weapons fighting pre-industrial forces. One area where Chinese forces achieved some success was guerrilla resistance. In areas where British forces attempted to move inland or maintain garrisons, they faced harassment from local militia and irregular forces. These irregular troops avoided direct confrontation, instead attacking supply lines, ambushing small units, and making it costly for British forces to hold territory. But guerrilla resistance couldn't prevent British naval forces from controlling coastal waters and major rivers. The Chinese government's response to military defeats was hampered by internal political divisions. Some officials argued for continuing resistance, believing that Chinese numerical superiority would eventually tell if forces were mobilized effectively. Others advocated negotiation, recognizing that China couldn't defeat Britain militarily, and that continuing the war would only increase casualties and damage without changing the ultimate outcome. Still others blamed defeats on specific commanders' incompetence or corruption, believing that better leadership could turn the war around. The Daguang Emperor received conflicting advice and intelligence. Some officials reported victories when defeats had occurred, either to avoid admitting their failures or because they genuinely didn't understand that Chinese forces had been routed. Others reported accurately but were disbelieved because the scale of defeat seemed impossible. The emperor struggled to understand how foreign barbarians with relatively small forces could be defeating the armies of the Celestial Empire. Lin Zexu, the commissioner whose actions had triggered the war, was dismissed from his position in September 1840 and sent into internal exile. The emperor blamed him for provoking the British into military action and for failing to adequately prepare Chinese defenses. Lin's dismissal reflected the emperor's frustration and his search for scapegoats, but it didn't change the military situation. Chinese forces continued losing battles regardless of who commanded them, because the fundamental problem was technological and organizational inferiority, not individual leadership failures. By 1842, British forces had positioned themselves to threaten the Grand Canal, the crucial waterway that transported tax grain and other supplies from southern China to Beijing. If British forces cut the Grand Canal, they would sever the connection between northern and southern China and threaten the emperor's ability to provision Beijing and maintain control. This strategic threat, combined with the string of military defeats and the inability to repel British forces, convinced Chinese negotiators that they had no choice but to accept British terms. The negotiation process revealed different assumptions about diplomacy and international relations. Chinese diplomacy traditionally operated within a tributary system where China was the central power, and other nations were vassal states that acknowledged Chinese superiority in exchange for trading, rights, and diplomatic recognition. The idea of negotiating as equals with foreign powers was alien to Chinese diplomatic tradition. British diplomacy operated within a European framework of sovereign states interacting as equals, forming alliances and treaties based on mutual interests rather than hierarchical relationships. British negotiators expected China to accept treaties as binding agreements between equals. They didn't understand or care about Chinese diplomatic traditions that would make such treaties psychologically and politically difficult for Chinese officials to accept. The specific British demands included monetary compensation for destroyed opium and war expenses, cession of Hong Kong Island to British sovereignty, opening of 5 ports to British trade and residence, abolition of the Cohong monopoly, establishment of fixed tariff rates, and official diplomatic relations with British representatives having direct access to Chinese officials. These demands were deliberately designed to dismantle the Canton system and establish British commercial presence on British terms throughout coastal China. Chinese negotiators attempted to minimize these concessions, offering to reopen trade at Canton on modified terms without accepting the broader demands. But British military pressure, including threatened attacks on Nanjing and positioning forces to cut the Grand Canal, made clear that rejecting British demands would mean continued war and further defeats. The choice wasn't between accepting British terms or maintaining the status quo, but between accepting British terms now or accepting them later after additional casualties and destruction. Treaty humiliation. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed on August 29, 1842, aboard HMS Cornwallis in Nanjing Harbor, was the first of the unequal treaties that would define China's relationship with Western powers for the next century. The treaty's terms were dictated by British military victory and accepted by Chinese authorities who lacked alternatives other than continued unsuccessful war. The monetary provisions required China to pay 21 million Spanish dollars as indemnity. This sum included 6 million for destroyed opium, 12 million for British war expenses, and 3 million for debts Chinese merchants owed British merchants. The amount was enormous by contemporary standards, equivalent to roughly half of China's annual governmental revenue. Payment was required in silver, further draining China's monetary system that was already under stress from opium-driven silver outflows. The territorial concession of Hong Kong Island gave Britain a permanent base adjacent to Canton. Hong Kong's harbour provided secure anchorage for British shipping. Its position allowed British forces to monitor and influence trade in the Pearl River Delta, and its cession to British sovereignty meant that Britain now possessed Chinese territory where British law applied and which could serve as a base for further expansion if desired. The cession was in perpetuity, meaning permanent rather than a lease that would eventually expire. The opening of 5 treaty ports, Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningbo, and Shanghai, to British residents and trade fundamentally changed Sino-British commercial relations. British merchants could now reside in these cities, conduct trade directly with Chinese merchants without going through the Cohong, and operate under consular jurisdiction where British law applied to British subjects. The treaty port system would become the foundation for foreign economic penetration of China. The tariff provisions established fixed customs duties that China couldn't modify without British agreement. This removed Chinese governmental control over tariff policy, preventing China from using customs duties to protect domestic industries or to regulate foreign trade. The fixed tariffs were relatively low, favoring British merchants over Chinese producers who now faced competition from British imports without the protection of adjustable tariffs. The diplomatic provisions required China to conduct official relations with Britain on the basis of equality. British consuls would be stationed in the treaty ports with authority over British subjects and right to communicate directly with local Chinese officials. A British minister could reside in Beijing and communicate with central government. This dismantled the tributary system for Sino-British relations, forcing China to accept European diplomatic norms. The treaty was carefully silent on opium. This omission was deliberate. British negotiators knew that explicitly protecting opium trade would make the treaty even more politically difficult for Chinese officials to accept and would expose Britain to moral criticism. By remaining silent, the treaty neither prohibited nor explicitly permitted opium imports. In practice, this ambiguity allowed opium trade to continue and even expand because Chinese authorities could no longer effectively enforce prohibition once British merchants had treaty rights to residence and trade. The Treaty of Nanjing was supplemented by the Treaty of the Bogue in 1843, which added further concessions. China granted Britain most favored nation status, meaning that any privileges China granted to other foreign powers would automatically extend to Britain. China agreed to allow British families to reside in the treaty ports, not just merchants, and the treaty established extraterritoriality. British subjects in China would be subject only to British law, tried in British courts by British officials, even for crimes committed against Chinese victims in Chinese territory. Extraterritoriality was particularly humiliating and problematic. It meant that British subjects could commit crimes in China without facing Chinese legal jurisdiction. Chinese authorities couldn't arrest, try, or punish British criminals. This created a situation where foreign nationals possessed legal privileges that Chinese citizens didn't enjoy in their own country, and it would be extensively abused, with British and other foreign criminals using extraterritoriality to escape accountability for crimes ranging from fraud to assault to murder. Other Western powers quickly demanded equal treatment under the Most Favored Nation clause. The United States negotiated the Treaty of Wangsha in 1844, obtaining the same trading rights, tariff rates, and extraterritoriality as Britain. France negotiated the Treaty of Whampoa, adding provisions protecting Christian missionaries and Chinese Christian converts. These additional treaties expanded the scope of foreign privileges and further restricted Chinese sovereignty. The impact of these treaties on Chinese authority and society was profound and lasting. China had been forced to accept diplomatic and commercial arrangements that violated traditional Chinese political philosophy and practice. The emperor's authority, theoretically unlimited within the Celestial Empire, had been constrained by treaties with foreign powers that couldn't be unilaterally modified. Chinese governmental control over trade, tariffs and legal jurisdiction had been surrendered in critical areas. The immediate effect on opium trade was dramatic expansion. With British merchants now having legal right to reside in multiple treaty ports, and with Chinese authorities unable to enforce prohibition effectively, opium imports increased substantially. By the late 1840s, annual imports had grown to approximately 50,000 chests, up from the 40,000 chests that had triggered Lin Zexu's crackdown. The number of addicted Chinese continued growing. British merchants, now operating with treaty protection, became more bold in their operations. They no longer had to rely solely on smuggling and bribing officials to avoid enforcement. They could operate semi-openly, storing opium at treaty ports and conducting sales through Chinese merchants who distributed the drug inland. Chinese authorities attempting to enforce prohibition faced British complaints that such enforcement violated treaty rights. The hypocrisy of this situation was apparent even to some British observers. Britain had fought a war ostensibly about property rights and diplomatic equality, achieving those goals through the Treaty of Nanjing. But the practical effect was protecting drug trafficking that China had legitimately prohibited. The opium merchants who had lobbied for British military intervention had achieved their objective, continued and expanded access to the Chinese market for their product. Some British officials and politicians felt shame about this outcome. The Earl of Shaftesbury called the opium trade utterly inconsistent with the honor and duties of a Christian kingdom. Other religious and moral reformers in Britain argued that the government should prohibit British merchants from trafficking opium, ending the trade through British law, even if China couldn't enforce prohibition effectively. But these moral arguments were unsuccessful against the commercial interests that profited from the trade and the governmental interests in Indian revenues derived from opium. The Chinese response to the treaty combined resentment, humiliation, and determination to learn from defeat. Intellectuals and officials recognized that China had been defeated primarily because of technological and organizational inferiority, not because of any innate Chinese weakness. The self-strengthening movement that would develop over subsequent decades aimed to acquire Western military technology and organizational methods while preserving Chinese cultural and political traditions. But the immediate aftermath of the First Opium War brought more immediate crises. The social impact of expanded opium addiction, combined with the economic strain of indemnity payments, created instability. The weakening of imperial authority demonstrated by military defeat emboldened domestic opponents of the Qing dynasty, and the presence of foreign merchants and missionaries in treaty ports created new sources of friction and conflict. The Taiping Rebellion, which began in 1850 and lasted until 1864, was partly influenced by the social and economic disruption created by the opium crisis and the aftermath of the First Opium War. The rebellion combined elements of Christian millenarianism, Chinese folk religion, and social reform aimed at addressing the corruption and decay that had allowed foreign powers to humiliate China. The rebellion would kill an estimated 20 to 30 million people, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The connection between opium trade, the First Opium War, and the Taiping Rebellion wasn't direct causation, but the opium crisis and military defeat contributed to creating conditions where massive rebellion became possible. The weakening of imperial authority, the social disruption from opium addiction, the economic strain from silver outflow and indemnity payments, and the psychological impact of humiliating defeat all contributed to undermining the stability of the Qing dynasty. Expanded operations. The period between the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 and the Second Opium War in 1856 saw dramatic expansion of opium imports, consolidation of the treaty port system, and increasing foreign influence in Chinese commerce and politics. British merchants, operating with treaty protection, built sophisticated commercial networks that penetrated deep into Chinese economy and society. Opium imports reached new heights during this period. Annual imports grew from approximately 50,000 chests in the late 1840s to over 80,000 chests by the mid-1850s. The total amount of opium entering China during these years exceeded £10 million annually. The number of Chinese addicts grew correspondingly, with estimates suggesting that by the 1850s, as many as 10 to 15% of adult males in coastal provinces were regular users. The distribution networks became more elaborate and sophisticated. British merchants in treaty ports sold opium to Chinese wholesalers who distributed it through networks of middlemen, reaching cities and towns throughout China. The opium traveled along rivers, roads, and canals that constituted China's internal trade routes. By the 1850s, opium was available in cities hundreds of miles from the coast, accessible to consumers throughout much of eastern and central China. The economic structure of the opium trade involved multiple layers of profit-taking. British merchants selling opium at treaty ports made substantial profits, typically selling for double or more what they had paid at the Calcutta auctions. Chinese wholesalers who purchased from British merchants sold to regional distributors at markup. These regional distributors sold to retailers at further markup, and retailers selling to individual consumers added final markup that might bring the price to 4 or 5 times what British merchants had originally charged. Each layer of this distribution network created stakeholders with economic interests in the trade's continuation. British merchants obviously profited, but so did Chinese wholesalers, distributors, retailers, and opium den operators. The corruption of Chinese officials continued, with bribes paid at each level to ensure that enforcement remained ineffective.
The result was a system where both foreign and Chinese commercial interests aligned around continuing and expanding a trade that was devastating Chinese society.
The treaty port system facilitated this expansion by providing bases where British merchants could operate with legal protection. Shanghai, which had been a relatively minor city when designated a treaty port in 1842, grew rapidly into China's dominant commercial center. British and other foreign merchants established trading houses, banks, and shipping companies. Warehouses, docks, and residential areas for foreign communities were constructed, and consular offices provided governance for foreign nationals under extraterritoriality. The foreign settlements in treaty ports operated as quasi-independent territories within Chinese cities. They had their own municipal governments, police forces, and courts that administered foreign law to foreign residents. Chinese authorities had no jurisdiction over these areas.
The settlements provided safe havens where foreign merchants could operate free from Chinese governmental control, creating what were essentially colonial enclaves on Chinese soil.
These foreign settlements became centers of opium distribution. British merchants stored opium in bonded warehouses in the settlements. Sales to Chinese merchants occurred within the foreign concessions where Chinese authorities couldn't interfere, and the extraterritoriality that protected foreign merchants from Chinese law made it effectively impossible for Chinese authorities to stop the trade at its source. The expansion of legitimate trade alongside opium created complicated economic relationships. British merchants weren't solely opium traders. They also dealt in tea, silk, cotton textiles, and other commodities. The same firms that trafficked opium also conducted legal trade in products beneficial to both Chinese and British economies. This mixing of illegal drug trafficking with legitimate commerce made it difficult to suppress the opium trade without disrupting other economic activities. Chinese domestic opium production began during this period as an attempt to reduce dependence on foreign imports. Some Chinese officials and merchants recognized that if opium consumption couldn't be prevented, at least the silver drain could be stopped by growing opium domestically. Chinese farmers in Yunnan, Sichuan, and other provinces began cultivating opium poppies, processing opium, and selling it in competition with imported British Indian opium. Domestic Chinese opium was generally considered inferior in quality to imported opium, but it was cheaper and more readily available. For poor addicts who couldn't afford expensive imported opium, domestic production provided accessible supply. By the 1850s, domestic Chinese opium production was beginning to rival imports in total volume, though imports remained significant because wealthy consumers preferred the higher quality imported product. The British merchants who had built fortunes on the opium trade diversified into other businesses while maintaining their opium operations. Jardine Matheson, the largest British opium trader, expanded into shipping, banking, insurance, and legitimate commodity trading. They established themselves as general merchant house rather than solely opium traffickers. But opium remained a critical part of their business and profits well into the late 19th century. These merchant houses wielded substantial political influence both in China and in Britain. In China, they had access to British consular officials and could lobby for governmental protection of their interests. In Britain, they maintained connections to Parliament, the East India Company's Court of Directors, and government ministries. Their financial success and the revenues they generated for British India gave them political weight that they used to resist restrictions on opium trade. The social consequences of mass opium addiction became increasingly severe during this period. Families were destroyed as addicted members spent household resources on opium. Productivity declined as workers became less capable due to addiction. Crime increased as desperate addicts stole to support their habits, and the mortality rate from opium-related causes grew as long-term heavy users suffered health deterioration that led to early death. The impact on Chinese military capacity was particularly concerning for the Qing dynasty. During the Taiping Rebellion, which raged from 1850 to 1864, government forces often struggled to suppress the rebels, partly because military units were riddled with opium addicts whose combat effectiveness was severely compromised. The rebellion's eventual suppression required mobilizing regional armies that were relatively less affected by opium addiction, but even these forces faced endemic drug use. Chinese intellectuals wrote increasingly desperate analyses of the opium crisis and its implications for Chinese society and national survival. They recognized that mass addiction was weakening China economically, militarily, and morally. They argued that the opium crisis demonstrated the need for fundamental reforms to strengthen China against foreign exploitation, but they struggled to identify effective remedies when prohibition had failed and when foreign powers actively protected the drug trade. British missionaries in China created additional complications during this period. The treaties protecting missionary activity had been negotiated partly to satisfy French demands, but British Protestant missionaries took full advantage of treaty rights to proselytize throughout China. Many missionaries were genuinely horrified by opium addiction's effects on Chinese people and spoke out against the trade.
They wrote letters and pamphlets describing the suffering addiction caused, explicitly criticizing British merchants and governmental policies that protected opium trafficking.
This created an awkward situation where British missionaries were condemning British merchants and British government policies while relying on those same merchants and that same government for protection under the treaty system. The moral contradiction was apparent. British Christians were criticizing the opium trade while British commerce depended on it, and British power enforced the treaties that allowed both opium trafficking and missionary work. Some missionaries argued that ending the opium trade was necessary to maintain Christian credibility with Chinese people. How could Christianity claim moral authority while Christians were profiting from destroying Chinese lives through drug addiction? The Chinese could reasonably view Christian preaching about morality as hypocritical when accompanied by Christian merchants dealing opium. These arguments had some impact on British public opinion, but didn't substantially affect governmental policies that prioritized commercial interests. The period also saw the beginning of organized Chinese anti-opium movements. Gentry leaders, intellectuals, and officials who opposed opium began forming associations to advocate for prohibition, to help addicts quit, and to promote resistance to foreign drugs. These movements operated within difficult constraints because open criticism of the treaty system could be viewed as disloyalty to the emperor, and because effective prohibition required resources, authority that local movements lacked. The anti-opium movements had limited short-term impact, but helped lay groundwork for later, more successful efforts. They kept the issue of opium addiction in public consciousness. They developed rehabilitation methods that would later be employed more widely, and they maintained the position that opium was a foreign poison that patriotic Chinese should resist.
This moral and patriotic framing would eventually contribute to more effective opposition once Chinese governmental capacity to enforce prohibition improved.
Social devastation. The long-term social consequences of mass opium addiction in 19th century China were profound and lasting, affecting family structures, economic productivity, public health, and social values in ways that compounded across generations. Understanding these consequences requires examining the experience of addiction at individual and family levels, not just in aggregate statistics. For individual addicts, the progression from initial use to severe dependency followed patterns documented by Chinese physicians and social observers. Initial users often experienced opium as pleasurable and seemingly harmless. The drug provided euphoria, relief from stress, and temporary escape from difficult life circumstances. These positive experiences encouraged continued use without immediate obvious negative consequences. As use became regular, tolerance developed. The same dose that initially produced strong euphoric effects produced weaker effects over time. Users needed to increase consumption to achieve desired results. This escalation happened gradually, with users often not recognizing they were becoming dependent until withdrawal symptoms emerged when use was interrupted. Physical dependence manifested through increasingly severe withdrawal symptoms. Addicts who couldn't obtain opium experienced muscle aches, abdominal cramping, sweating, anxiety, insomnia, and intense drug craving. These symptoms were sufficiently unpleasant that addicts would go to extreme lengths to obtain opium and avoid withdrawal. The compulsion to use became physical necessity rather than voluntary choice. Long-term heavy use produced serious health consequences. Chronic malnutrition was common because opium suppressed appetite and because addicts spent money on drugs rather than food. Respiratory problems developed from inhaling opium smoke. Infectious diseases spread through shared pipes in opium dens. Dental problems resulted from neglect and poor nutrition. Overall physical deterioration left chronic users appearing gaunt, prematurely aged, and generally unwell. The cognitive effects of chronic opium use impaired work performance and social functioning. Users experienced difficulty concentrating, memory problems, and slowed mental processing. These cognitive effects reduced productivity in occupations requiring sustained attention or complex decision-making. For workers in physically demanding occupations, the combination of physical deterioration and cognitive impairment often meant they could no longer perform their jobs effectively. The financial burden of addiction destroyed families economically. Opium prices were high relative to typical wages. An addicted laborer might spend half or more of daily wages on opium. For families already living on marginal incomes, this diversion of resources from food, housing, and other necessities to drug purchases meant poverty and deprivation. Children went hungry, rents went unpaid, and debts accumulated. The social consequences within families were equally devastating. Addicted parents neglected children. Family conflict escalated as spouses fought over money spent on opium. Trust broke down as addicts lied about their drug use and stole from family members to support their habits. The moral authority of parents and elders was undermined when they were known to be addicts. These family breakdowns rippled through communities as extended family networks that traditionally provided social support weakened. For women specifically, opium addiction created particular vulnerabilities in a society where women already had limited economic and social options. Addicted women from poor families sometimes resorted to prostitution to support their habits. Addiction during pregnancy affected children, potentially creating addiction in infants who were born to addicted mothers. And the social stigma attached to female addiction was often more severe than for male addicts, creating additional shame and social isolation. The impact on children of addicted parents extended beyond immediate material deprivation. Children learned to view opium use as normal adult behavior. Some began using opium themselves at young ages, either given by parents as sedative or pain reliever, or imitating adult behavior. Others developed psychological issues from growing up in chaotic households where parental addiction dominated family dynamics. The intergenerational transmission of addiction and dysfunction created cycles difficult to break. The economic consequences at societal level were substantial, though difficult to quantify precisely. Reduced labor productivity from widespread addiction meant that economic output was lower than it would have been without the opium crisis. The diversion of household resources from productive investment to opium consumption represented economic loss, and the silver drain from China to pay for opium imports represented transfer of wealth that might otherwise have funded capital formation or development. The military implications were severe and well documented by Chinese officials. Army units throughout China experienced significant opium addiction among soldiers. During the Taiping Rebellion and other military conflicts, commanders reported that many soldiers were addicts, whose combat effectiveness was severely compromised. Some soldiers would abandon positions to seek opium, or would fail to perform duties due to withdrawal symptoms. The weakening of military capacity during a period when China faced multiple internal and external threats was directly attributable partly to opium addiction. Government officials' addiction posed particular problems for governance. Officials who were addicts were vulnerable to corruption by merchants who could supply them with opium. Their judgment was impaired by drug use. Their attention to official duties declined as addiction progressed, and their moral authority to enforce laws and maintain social order was undermined when they were known users of a prohibited substance. The corruption of the official class through opium contributed to the general weakening of governmental capacity. The scholar gentry class that traditionally provided educated leadership in Chinese society experienced significant addiction rates. The social acceptability of opium smoking in elite circles combined with the stress of examination systems and political careers led many scholars to become regular users. This addiction among intellectual elites affected Chinese cultural production, institutional innovation, and capacity to respond to the challenges of foreign pressure and internal crisis. The moral and psychological impact of the opium crisis extended beyond individual addicts to affect Chinese society's collective self-conception. The humiliation of being unable to prevent foreign powers from forcing drug imports contributed to a sense of national weakness and loss of confidence. Chinese intellectuals writing during this period expressed shame and frustration that China had been reduced to helpless victim of foreign drug trafficking. The religious and philosophical dimensions of the opium crisis raised questions about traditional Chinese values and institutions. Confucian philosophy emphasized self-cultivation, social harmony, and filial piety, values that opium addiction directly contradicted. The failure of Confucian education and social structures to prevent mass addiction led some to question whether traditional teachings were adequate for addressing modern challenges. This crisis of confidence contributed to broader questioning of Chinese traditions that would intensify in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The public health infrastructure in 19th century China was inadequate to address the opium crisis effectively. Traditional Chinese medicine had treatments for various ailments, but lacked effective methods for treating severe opium addiction. Some physicians attempted various remedies, but none were reliably successful at helping severely addicted patients achieve sustained abstinence. The absence of effective treatment meant that once addiction developed, it was often a lifelong condition. Some Chinese reformers attempted to establish rehabilitation facilities where addicts could receive treatment and support for quitting. These facilities employed various methods including gradual dose reduction, herbal medicines claimed to ease withdrawal, and moral exhortation to strengthen willpower. Success rates were generally low, partly because of the severe nature of opium addiction, and partly because addicts often lacked social and economic supports necessary for maintaining abstinence after leaving treatment. The criminal justice implications of mass addiction were significant. Theft increased as desperate addicts stole to support their habits. Violence sometimes erupted in disputes over opium or money. Opium dens became sites of various criminal activities beyond drug use itself. But prosecution of addiction-related crimes was complicated by the sheer number of offenders, the limited capacity of justice systems, and the fact that many officials responsible for enforcement were themselves users or complicit in the trade. The regional variation in addiction rates reflected patterns of opium distribution and local economic conditions. Coastal provinces with direct access to imported opium experienced higher addiction rates than interior provinces. Urban areas had more opium dens and easier access than rural areas. Wealthier regions where people could afford opium experienced more addiction than poor regions. These regional differences created uneven social impact, with some areas devastated while others were relatively less affected. The cultural production of the period reflected the opium crisis in literature, art, and popular culture. Chinese authors wrote stories and novels featuring opium addicts, often as tragic figures destroyed by the drug. Artists created images depicting opium dens and addicts. Popular songs and theatrical performances addressed opium themes. This cultural attention both reflected the prevalence of addiction and contributed to shaping social attitudes about the drug and its users. Moral reckoning. The ethical dimensions of the British opium trade generated controversy from its inception, with moral arguments against the trade being made by religious reformers, some parliamentarians, and even a few merchants and officials who participated in the system. These moral objections persisted throughout the 19th century, but were ultimately unsuccessful in ending the trade until other political and economic factors made prohibition feasible. The fundamental moral question was straightforward. Was it acceptable to profit from selling addictive drugs to people in a country whose government had explicitly prohibited those drugs? Critics argued that the answer was obviously no. Opium was harmful and addictive. Chinese authorities had legitimate authority to prohibit it within their territory. British merchants were deliberately undermining Chinese law and creating mass addiction for profit, and the British government was protecting and even encouraging this drug trafficking through military force and diplomatic pressure. Defenders of the trade employed several arguments. First, they claimed that British merchants were simply meeting existing Chinese demand. If they didn't supply opium, someone else would. Portuguese, Americans, or even Chinese domestic producers. British merchants weren't creating addiction. They were serving a market that existed independent of their actions. This argument conveniently ignored that British merchants had actively promoted opium consumption to expand the market. Second, defenders argued that Chinese prohibition was hypocritical because opium cultivation and use existed within China itself. If Chinese authorities truly opposed opium, why did they allow domestic production? This argument ignored that domestic production was also illegal, and that it was primarily British imports that had created the scale of addiction that made domestic production economically attractive. Third, defenders framed the issue as one of free trade. Merchants should be allowed to trade freely in goods that willing buyers wished to purchase. Government restrictions on trade were impediments to natural economic forces and harmful to prosperity. This free trade argument assumed that all commerce was beneficial regardless of what products were being traded, treating opium as equivalent to any other commodity rather than recognizing its unique addictive and harmful properties. Fourth, defenders noted that opium was used medicinally in Britain and other Western countries without prohibition. Why should opium be treated differently in China than in the West? This argument ignored that Western use was primarily medicinal and at much lower scales than recreational use in China, and that Western countries did regulate opium sales to prevent abuse. Religious and humanitarian critics of the opium trade rejected these defenses. They argued that profiting from human suffering through drug addiction was morally wrong regardless of whether someone else might do it if you didn't. They pointed out that the scale of British imports vastly exceeded what would occur from domestic production alone, making British merchants directly responsible for creating addiction affecting millions. They noted that free trade arguments didn't justify trafficking in harmful substances, and that moral and legal constraints on commerce were legitimate. British missionaries in China were particularly vocal critics of the opium trade. They witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of addiction on Chinese families and communities. They found their evangelism efforts hampered by Chinese association of Christianity with opium. Both were products British merchants were promoting in China, and they felt moral obligation to condemn what they saw as a profound evil being perpetrated by their countrymen. Some missionaries wrote detailed accounts of opium's effects that were published in Britain and used by anti-opium advocates to build public opposition to the trade. These accounts described the physical and social destruction caused by addiction, the corruption of Chinese officials through bribery, and the suffering of Chinese people who wanted to quit but couldn't overcome physical dependence. The missionary accounts provided moral weight to arguments against the trade. The religious arguments against opium emphasized themes of human dignity, social responsibility, and moral duty. Christian ethics taught that humans were created in God's image and possessed inherent dignity that should be respected. Deliberately creating addiction that destroyed that dignity was therefore fundamentally wrong. Social responsibility required considering effects of one's actions on others, particularly vulnerable populations, and moral duty meant refusing to profit from harm regardless of legal technicalities or commercial opportunities. These religious arguments influenced some British public opinion, but faced obstacles in translating moral conviction into policy change. The opium trade generated enormous revenue for British India and substantial profits for British merchants. The British government depended on Indian revenues for imperial administration. Ending the opium trade would mean finding alternative revenue sources, which politically difficult and economically complicated. Parliamentary debates about the opium trade occurred repeatedly throughout the 19th century. Critics introduced motions condemning the trade and calling for its prohibition. These motions typically received support from religious representatives, some liberals, and humanitarian reformers, but they were consistently defeated by majorities who prioritized commercial interests, imperial revenues, and geopolitical considerations over moral objections. William Gladstone's opposition to the First Opium War and his later efforts as Prime Minister to reduce British involvement in the opium trade represented the highest-level political expression of moral opposition. Gladstone argued that Britain's reputation and moral standing were damaged by association with drug trafficking. He believed that commercial gains from opium were not worth the moral costs. But even Gladstone found it difficult to end the trade because of the complex economic and political interests involved. The moral reckoning extended beyond the opium trade itself to broader questions about imperialism and European relations with non-European societies. The opium trade exemplified a pattern where European powers used military and economic superiority to extract benefits from non-European peoples regardless of those peoples' wishes or welfare. Critics argued that this exploitative imperialism was morally wrong and contradicted European claims to civilization and enlightenment. Defenders of imperialism argued that European expansion brought benefits including technology, trade, and modernization to traditional societies. They portrayed resistance to European influence as backward and contrary to human progress. But the opium trade made these civilizing arguments difficult to sustain. How could forced drug trafficking be presented as beneficial modernization? The racial dimensions of the opium trade also attracted criticism from some British observers. The trade treated Chinese people as less worthy of protection than Europeans. British law regulated opium sales within Britain to prevent addiction, but British merchants actively promoted addiction in China. This double standard reflected underlying assumptions about racial superiority and the lesser value of non-European lives. Some British reformers argued that racial equality required applying the same moral standards to commerce with non-Europeans as would apply to commerce among Europeans. If selling addictive drugs to British workers would be wrong, then selling opium to Chinese workers was equally wrong. This argument challenged the racial assumptions underlying British imperial policies and commercial practices. The economic counterarguments to moral criticism emphasized the practical benefits of the opium trade. The trade balanced accounts with China, allowing Britain to import tea without exporting silver. It generated revenue for Indian administration. It provided employment for Indian farmers, British merchants, and Chinese distributors. Ending the trade would harm these economic interests without necessarily helping Chinese addicts, who might simply obtain opium from other sources. These economic arguments treated moral considerations as subordinate to commercial interests. They assumed that economic benefits justified practices that might be morally questionable, and they employed consequentialist reasoning that focused on outcomes rather than on whether the actions themselves were ethical regardless of consequences. The philosophical debates about the opium trade reflected broader 19th century arguments about utilitarianism, moral duty, and the relationship between individual liberty and social welfare. Utilitarian arguments suggested that policies should maximize overall happiness or welfare. If opium trade generated economic benefits that exceeded the harms from Chinese addiction, utilitarians might conclude it was justified. But measuring and comparing these benefits and harms was practically impossible and morally dubious. Deontological ethics that emphasized moral duties regardless of consequences suggested that drug trafficking was inherently wrong because it violated duties of respect for persons and non-maleficence. These arguments resonated with religious critics who believed certain actions were wrong in themselves, not just because of their consequences. The opium trade violated these moral duties by deliberately harming people for profit. The gradual shift in British public opinion against the opium trade occurred slowly over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Growing awareness of addiction's harms, missionary accounts of suffering in China, and changing attitudes about imperialism all contributed. The moral arguments that had been made for decades gained traction as economic dependence on opium revenues decreased and as alternative revenue sources for Indian administration became available. Economic legacy. The economic consequences of the opium trade extended far beyond the immediate profits to British merchants and revenues to British India. The trade fundamentally altered patterns of international commerce, monetary flows, and economic development in ways that shaped both Chinese and global economies for generations. This silver drain had severe consequences for China's monetary system. Silver was the basis of Chinese currency for large transactions and tax payments. As silver became scarce, its value relative to copper coins increased. This created effective deflation that harmed debtors, made tax payments more burdensome for farmers paying in copper, but assessed in silver, and contributed to economic distress that fed social unrest. The scale of silver outflow was substantial. Estimates suggest that during the peak decades of the opium trade in the mid-19th century, China was losing tens of millions of taels of silver annually. This represented a significant portion of China's silver stock and created monetary instability that Chinese authorities struggled to manage. The silver famine contributed to the breakdown of monetary systems and commercial relationships that had functioned effectively for centuries. For British India, opium revenue was crucial to colonial finances. At its peak, opium sales generated approximately 1/7 of total Indian government revenue. This made the British colonial administration financially dependent on drug trafficking in ways that shaped policy and made it difficult to end the trade even when moral arguments suggested it should stop. Any decline in opium revenues required finding alternative funding sources, which meant either increasing other taxes on Indians or reducing colonial expenditures. The structure of opium cultivation in India created economic distortions with long-term consequences. Forcing farmers to grow opium rather than food crops reduced food production in affected regions. The coercive cultivation system that kept farmers indebted to the East India Company undermined agricultural development and rural prosperity. And the focus on opium as cash crop reduced diversification and increased vulnerability to market fluctuations. Indian farmers received only a small fraction of opium's final sale price. The East India Company captured most profits through their monopoly, paying farmers fixed prices below market value. This extraction of value from Indian agricultural labor to fund British colonial administration and enrich British merchants represented classic colonial exploitation that impoverished the colonized to benefit the colonizers. The merchant houses that dominated the China trade accumulated enormous wealth from opium. Firms like Jardine Matheson used opium profits to diversify into shipping, banking, insurance, and legitimate commodity trading. They became powerful commercial enterprises with operations throughout Asia. The fortunes built on opium provided capital for legitimate businesses, meaning that drug trafficking profits were laundered into respectable commerce. Individual British merchants and officials who participated in the opium trade often became wealthy. Some returned to Britain and used their fortunes to purchase estates, enter politics, or establish themselves in elite society. The respectability that wealth provided allowed them to escape accountability for how the money was earned. Chinese suffering from addiction was distant and easy to ignore when presenting oneself as successful merchant or benevolent philanthropist. The banking system that developed around the opium trade created financial infrastructure that shaped Asian commerce more broadly. Banks that financed opium shipments, provided letters of credit, and handled currency exchange became dominant financial institutions. Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation (HSBC), founded in 1865, grew out of the financial needs of the China trade, including opium. The bank became one of the world's largest and continues operating today. though its origins in opium financing are downplayed in official histories. The development of Hong Kong as financial and commercial center was directly connected to opium. Britain acquired Hong Kong specifically to support the China trade after the First Opium War. The island's deep harbor provided anchorage for ships carrying opium and other goods. Its status as British territory meant that merchants could operate under British law free from Chinese governmental interference, and its strategic position adjacent to Canton made it ideal base for trade with southern China. Hong Kong's economy in the 19th century was substantially based on the opium trade. Opium merchants maintained offices there. Warehouses stored opium before distribution. Banks financed opium transactions, and the colonial government collected revenues from licensing and taxing opium-related commerce. The city's prosperity was built partly on drug trafficking, though this history is often obscured in accounts emphasizing Hong Kong's role as free port and commercial hub. The treaty port system created economic enclaves where foreign commerce operated under Western legal and commercial practices. These ports became centers of modernization, introducing Western business methods, banking practices and industrial technologies to China. But they were also sites of unequal economic relationships, where Chinese sovereignty was compromised and where foreign merchants operated with advantages that Chinese merchants lacked. The cotton trade developed alongside opium as British merchants sought legitimate commodities to balance their purchases of Chinese tea and silk. British textile manufacturers wanted to sell cotton cloth in China, but Chinese domestic textile production was competitive, and Chinese consumers showed limited interest in British fabrics. The opium trade indirectly supported cotton exports by providing a means to balance accounts even when cotton sales alone wouldn't have justified the trade. The economic relationship between Britain and China, established through the opium trade and treaty system, created patterns of dependency and unequal exchange that persisted even after opium declined in importance. Britain used its superior military and commercial power to extract economic benefits from China through various mechanisms, including favorable tariff rates, most favored nation provisions, and control of key ports and infrastructure. Chinese domestic industry struggled to compete against foreign imports that entered under low fixed tariff rates. Chinese merchants faced disadvantages relative to foreign merchants, who enjoyed extraterritorial privileges and whose governments would intervene diplomatically or militarily to protect their interests. Chinese economic development was distorted by this unequal relationship in ways that contributed to China's relative decline during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The long-term economic consequences for China included delayed industrialization, distorted development patterns, and loss of economic sovereignty. Resources that might have funded industrial development were instead drained through opium purchases, indemnity payments, and unequal trade. The treaty system prevented China from using tariff policy to protect infant industries or to generate revenue for development. And the presence of foreign-controlled enclaves within Chinese cities created economic dualism that hindered integrated national development.